Thank you very much indeed. Now, this is a golden opportunity for questions. So who's going to stick their hand up first? Right, jolly good. Thank you. And again, who you are and who you represent.
Rob Henry from Hertfordshire Police. Very quickly, what in your view, Sir Hugh Orde, was the blockage or the stutter on the regional forces structure?
Politics. It is as simple as that. Whatever anyone says around there was no local support for it, there comes a time when you have to lead your people, it seems to me. And there was no political will in the last government for this. And I used to raise it with Alan Johnson, who I had great admiration for, very good Home Secretary. And he just said, it's not going to happen. Politics. I've had the same conversation with the policing minister, and he said the same. The argument is, and Nick Herbert, he may have raised it this morning, he said I couldn't get it through Parliament. And that, I think, is because maybe it's our fault, maybe it's just, there's just lack of interest in anything around policing that's not local. And if you look at what, the threats that, certainly when I was in my previous life, we kept people and cops alive because we had guys at the centre working flat out behind the scenes gathering intelligence. No one ever saw that. But I certainly wasn't going to move them to put them into a uniform on the front line. But the votes, if one's honest about it, I think the votes are in local policing. And that's where the focus is. And it's one of those real frustrations, because if it was the Chief of Hearts, I think, and the Chief of Bed said, look, we can save 80% through collaboration. It takes huge effort. I have travelled the country visiting on my regional meetings, second class, obviously. Well, I've got a Boris bike, actually, you get around London. Brilliant. I recommend them highly. But as I go around the regional meetings, what I see is lots of effort into collaboration, but it's all different. That is entirely unsurprising. Some forces are better off than others. You have to look at Chris Sims, who's got one of the biggest challenges. It's not his fault, it's just his funding streams are so skewed that when government take a big chunk out, he's got a problem. Likewise, Merseyside. An awful lot of their funding is central. So it's blocked because of politics, and that's not a party political statement, it's across the parties. My sense is the public would understand this if it was sold properly. My sense is this is too important to be subject to party political games, and some sensible, quiet conversations between political leaders, across governments may just get them to understand, may just then say, look, this is so important. If we can drive 20% out of back office, chief officers, command teams, as well as, more formal amalgamations, which are easier to do when there's one chief and one police and crime commissioner or one police authority, I think we could save a shed load of cash, and that means you save people at the front line.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think Sir Hugh knows what I think about that. But then I'm a politician. We have two more. Gentleman at the back, and then here. Thank you.
Sir, Mark Sweet from Lancashire Police Federation. In your presentation there, you actually posed us a question, I think, when you put up your wall, and you said you didn't know where the tipping point is. All the bricks in the wall were actually departments, so they were posts. The tipping point for this are the post holders and the goodwill of those post holders. And I invite you to feed back to this government that they're rapidly losing the goodwill of those officers. And as soon as that goodwill's gone, that wall will come down.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think people are being pushed as they are. And I joined pre-Edmund Davis. And at that point, there was a tipping point. Because you actually, in those days, you did have cops on income support. You had cops with free school meals for their kids. And everyone lived in a police house because they couldn't dreamt of affording it. Then you had this exponential sudden increase about early 80s in police pay, which has then kept track. And of course, until, I'm sure one of your other favourite people, one of the previous Home Secretaries stopped that deal, we did quite well. What's interesting about Windsor's report is if you look at where we are now, where police service is now in the public sector, we're at the top end. I think that's the right place to be, because it's the uncontrolled environment argument. It's a very different piece of business to going into a school. Well, I have huge admiration for what teachers do, especially my kids. But, I think that's a different sort of issue. So I understand the point. I also sense a huge frustration with what has been the deliberate and one could argue vindictive campaign in the press to highlight the most ridiculous parts of old agreements, which yes, they exist. But I think probably the most fury I sensed from the front line was the notion that any cop would even dream of claiming 4 hours for a phone call. But that was a front page or semi-front page of one of the big papers. It's a very, what I can say is we argue long and hard to try and stop that sort of stuff. The media at the minute are just not interested. There's a certain faction of the media who are out to discredit what we do. So we have to hold our nerve on that. I'm happy to take the message back, and I'm also very conscious, and certainly my last one, cops work for nothing, actually, on some of this stuff. Certainly if it meant keeping their colleagues safe. And we have to keep that going. We have to lead our people through this. And rest assured, on the fairness agenda, we will do our level best. We have to take some cut. We have to accept that. And PMB is critical to how we fine-tune what Tom Windsor's come up with. In fairness to Windsor, and I've met him on many occasions, he has huge admiration for the police. There's no question about that. And some of his recommendations reflect that. He had a very difficult task to do. He's also made sure, or we all have made sure, that the money that is saved does not get taken out of policing. And we've been very clear on that. The ACPO submission was that the money should be re-engineered around the pay, around police pay, not elsewhere. But he chose not to take that. We had to be grown up about that and move on. On the numbers, the 200 million savings he talks about, well, the jury's out and lots of chiefs are doing lots of work, so it affects different forces differently. Certainly, if you look at some of the issues, I ran a crime unit when I was in the Met many years ago. We had 2 ambit teams, as your point, goodwill, on call, 24/7 for the next murder. And when we went to South London, there was 2 of them. Well, that would now be costing me £500 a day under the Windsor reforms, plus for call-out. And of course, if they turn out, it's the middle of the night, so they get enhanced rates. So it's got to be worked through as to what that actually means for different forces, about how much saving there is. But frankly, if that saving can keep some people in jobs, it's not a bad place to be. But we're very mindful of the impact. And my big worry, and it's the PMAS work, which many of you will see, is the lower end service, the vulnerability of cops who are quite new in service. Some of the older guys, yes, you'll take a disproportionate hit because you're at the top end of the pay scale, but it's for guys with 4 to 8 year bands worrying me greatly. But I'm happy to communicate the message.
Thank you. And a question here.
Sol Taylor, South West Command in the Met Police. This morning we heard quite a few people emphasise the issue about money, and for me, we've looked at the problem in the wrong approach. We should be looking at the money aspects. We've heard some possible solutions. So, for instance, this morning we've heard that lost property. We got rid of lost dogs in the past. There's lost property. There's thousands of calls, thousands of pounds tied up in that. So should we not be looking at areas of demand reduction? We saw the graph from Surrey Police, and there we can save millions of pounds that will actually save millions of thousands of jobs. Merseyside, they've confiscated lots of money, put it back in. We need to change some of the bureaucracy and the flexibility around rules in government so that that money can be saved, put back into policing. Right,
and the harsh facts are quite simple. You cannot take 20% out of the budget, which is 83% people on average, without losing people. And that's what chiefs are saying. That's what some of those who are described perhaps as slightly noisier are actually articulating very clearly, so the public understand what we're challenging. Not one chief or not one officer I've ever heard is saying that means we're going to cut 20% of service. We're going to do our best to maintain the service with smaller people, which is a small number of people, not smaller people. I hadn't thought that may be an idea. So that's a real challenge. But what you're talking about, Simon, is therefore we've got to do a number of things. We've got to free up the front line to succeed, and this government is very committed to the empowerment agenda and less control from the centre, although there are some quite interesting central things coming out of the Home Office in bits and pieces now as people realise just how difficult that is. But you have to free the front line to make decisions, and chief officers have to say, I will take the risk for that. Because we talk, it's not just the imprecise environment which people work in, it's the fact we ask them to make split-second decisions with incomplete information, with no information, with imperfect information, conflicting information, or no information at all, downright lies. What cops cannot do is refer upwards. They cannot defer the decision. They have to do something, because otherwise they wouldn't have been called in most of the things they get to do. What that means, that's a long way of saying things will go wrong, not because of someone's to blame, because sometimes unforeseen consequences occur when you try and do the right thing, which I think was one of the conversations earlier. I think Simon's talking about doing the right thing later, or someone is. Now, so we've got to take that risk and say, if you take a risk, because you're going to have to, because we've reduced this very restrictive policy, and Sarah Thornton is having a bonfire of policy to try and take it down to key principles. We also had to, the other part of the deal was chiefs say, look, if you do something for the right reason, not stupid, if you do something for the right reason and get it wrong, we will protect you. And I used to have this conversation in Ireland, when, as all chiefs do, the sort of rolling road shows, go around to speak to quite large groups of police officers and support staff. And I did it for quite a few years. The main reason was actually to say thank you for what they'd done, but then we had a free-for-all open questions. And you could say it, and I could say it directly. Take risk, trust me. trust is good, but actually still you can sense police officers say, no, yeah, I'll just write it down, Governor, because actually it's not you, it may be the IPCC, or it may be some inquiry or a judicial inquiry, 5 years later saying, well, that's all very interesting, but if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. We're going to have to push back against that. What I can tell you is when I left, the last one I did, I said, not only do I mean it, can anyone in this room put their hands up? Do they know anyone that has been disciplined for making an honest mistake? And they couldn't because they hadn't. But that takes time to get people to understand and believe. So we've got to free up, we've got to let our people make the judgments, we've got to give them broad frameworks and allow them to take risk, and that's part of that equation. And the other bit, which you touch on, and you're right, is what do we stop doing? And no one, and I've done 6 party conferences now, fringe events with the Federation and the Superintendents Association. Interesting, they were all packed. There's huge interest in policing at the grassroots of all political parties. They all wanted more local policing, and no one could tell us what they wanted less of. And you talk about lost property. People in this room will remember the Fundamental Policing Review years ago. They identified several thousand tasks police do, and we got rid of 2. One was convoys on large loads, which is civilianised or privatised, and one was lost dogs, and lots of forces tell me they've got lost dogs back. It's very difficult to lose something, and that's the real hard question. And if you look at the central structure now, the MPIA, you're probably delighted that the chief is going from the MPIA, but if you look at what they do, there is no funding. MPIA took a massive hit over the last 2 years, 30 million this year, I think, on top of the 30 million the year before. All national training, all the stuff the MPIA do to support forces at a national level, much of it now will be unfunded. So it either gets transferred to forces, like the Police National Database has recently, or it stops. So, you know, there's some big challenges ahead, but you're right. And the more we can simplify the processes and let officers get on and do the day job without interference and massive over-accountability, the more chance we've got of pulling it off.